Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to show you how to do a variation of the mattress stitch. I showed you in my previous video how to do the original form of mattress stitch, and it's very popular because it creates a neat seam on the right side of the knitting. However, the disadvantage of it is that it creates a chunky ridge on the inside or the wrong side of your knitting. The variation I'm going to show you today combats this and creates a much flatter, less bulky seam. The only downside is that it's not quite as sturdy as the original mattress stitch. In order to follow along, you're going to need a large blunt needle. I'm using a plastic tapestry needle and a piece of yarn. I'm using a yarn in a contrasting colour, but of course you'll be using a matching colour. The piece of yarn will need to be long enough to seam along the whole edge, plus enough at each end to weave in. A lot of the time people leave a very long yarn tail when they bind off their knitting, and then they use this yarn tail to do the seaming. So you can do that, or you can cut a separate piece of yarn. Okay, so as you can see, I've already knit 2 swatches of stockinette stitch. The cast on edges are closest to me, the bound off edges are furthest away, and obviously the side edges, also called selvages, are to the right and to the left of each swatch. I just want to note here that you can seam in the opposite direction to the direction I'm going to go in today. So you can start seaming from the bound off edge and move towards the cast on edge. The only difference is that where I point out a column of V-shaped stitches, you'll instead have the reverse. So you'll have upside down V's. As long as all the stitches in both pieces of knitting are pointing in the same direction, the mattress stitch will work. Okay, so let's have a closer look at the edges we're going to join. The first column of V-shaped stitches on the edge is the selvage. And you should be able to see that even though it's a column of V-shaped stitches, they look a bit different to the columns of V-shaped stitches in the rest of the stockinette stitch. And that's because in the selvage there are little knots or twists in the yarn. The original form of mattress stitch involves picking up horizontal bars of yarn between the selvage and the rest of the stockinette stitch, i.e. 1 stitch away from the edge. However, with the variation that I'm going to show you today, we instead work half a stitch from the edge. In order to follow this tutorial, you're going to need to recognise the loops and the knots on the edge of this selvage. So all along the selvage you have a loop, then a knot, then a loop, then a knot, and so on. The knots are the more compact areas where the yarn is twisted, and the loops are a bit looser because there is no twist in the yarn, and you can open them up a lot easier. So here you can see a loop, and another loop here, and in between those 2 loops is a knot, which you can recognise because the yarns cross over each other at this point. During this process we're going to be moving from loop to loop along these edges. Another thing I want to point out, which you may already have noticed, is that the right hand swatch is longer than the left hand swatch. Usually you'll be seaming 2 edges that are exactly the same length and contain the same number of stitches. However, occasionally, either by mistake or design, there might be a slight difference in the stitch number of the selvages. So for my first demonstration, I'm just going to pretend that these swatches are the same length and have the same number of rows in them. And then for my second demonstration, I'll show you how to compensate for extra stitches in one selvage compared to the other. Okay, so to begin, you need to take your needle up through the very corner of the swatch. As you can see, I'm coming up through the bottom left corner of the right hand swatch. Make sure to leave a yarn tail of at least 6 inches so that you can weave it in later. If you're going to be seaming using a yarn tail that's already attached to your knitting, then you can skip this very first step. Next, you bring the needle up through the opposite corner. Then bring the needle underneath the piece of yarn crossing between the 2 edges Then back up through the corner that the yarn first went through the same stitch. Then we need to move over to the opposite edge again. And basically the idea of this method is that you go down through a loop, under a knot, and then up through the loop above it. And you do this all the way along the seam. So I take my needle down through the first loop, then go under the knot, and up through the loop above it. And that's all there is to it. You're just moving from loop to loop. Then you simply move over to the other edge and do exactly the same. So you find the first and second loops and the knot in between. Then take your needle down through that first loop on the edge, down under the knot, and then up through the loop above. We then move over to the opposite edge again, and we go down through this loop where the yarn has already been through. Then we go under the knot and up through the next loop. Then it's over to the opposite edge again, down through the loop where the yarn has already been through, under the knot, and up through the next loop. As you're going along, you should keep your stitches nice and loose, but then every inch or two, make sure to tighten them up. Do this by carefully pulling on the yarn in the direction of the seam. After I've tightened the stitches, I like to stretch the seam horizontally and vertically just to make sure that it's not too tight. You still want to have a little bit of give in the seam. And you simply carry on moving in the same way from loop to loop all along the edge. As I said before, I'm just going to pretend for this demo that these swatches are the same length. So I'm only going to go as far as the end of the shorter swatch. Once you've been through the last loop on each edge, you can then go through the corner of the opposite swatch and then underneath the yarn that passes between the swatches and tighten to bring the top edges together. You would then simply weave in the yarn tails. And as you can see from the right side of the knitting, it looks just like the original mattress stitch, which is almost invisible. However, on the back you can see that this method makes a much less bulky seam, particularly if we compare it directly with the original form of mattress stitch. Okay, so lastly I'm going to show you how to deal with a difference in edge length. Obviously you can see that the right hand swatch is longer than the left hand one, so I'm going to show you how to align the top and bottom edges. I'm not going to do the entire edge, I'm just going to start part way in just to show you very briefly. So the idea is basically that on the longer edge you're going to do a full stitch. And by a full stitch I mean going from loop to loop. Whereas on the shorter edge we're going to do half a stitch, where we're going to go from loop to knot, or knot to loop. And because we're doing shorter stitches on the shorter edge, that's going to compensate for the difference in length. Okay, so I've started with a couple of normal stitches by going from loop to loop on each side. On the left hand edge we're going to go down into a loop and then up through a knot. To come up through the knot you need to go under the outside leg of that knot, where the outside leg is a diagonal piece of yarn that crosses in front. So once you've done that you go over to the opposite edge and you go down through a loop and up through a loop. So what you're doing is compressing that longer edge to make it the same length as the shorter edge. Then we go back to the shorter edge and go down through the knot in the same place as the yarn came through it previously, and then up through the next loop. Please note that you want to do these half stitches in pairs, so 2 at a time. That way you start on a loop and end on a loop, which means you can get back to doing normal stitches very easily. I then repeated these stitches. So I did a normal stitch, then a half stitch, a normal stitch, and another half stitch. You don't need to do this all the way along the edge, you just need to do it enough times to align the top and bottom edges. So you would kind of guesstimate how many of these half stitches you would need to do, and then spread them out evenly along the edge. Once you've taken the yarn through the last loop on each side, make sure you go through the opposite corner as well. Then take the needle underneath the yarn that passes between the two edges, and then tighten. And as you can see, the top edge now lines up nicely. So even though it's uncommon to have to join edges at a slightly different lengths, at least now you know how to do it. I really hope this video has been helpful, and thank you very much for watching.